In the sterile courtroom of downtown Atlanta, the air thick with tension and the scent of old wood polish, Michelle Williams sits quietly in the defendant's section, her hands folded carefully in her lap. At 28 years old, she moves, with the measured grace of someone who has learned to make herself invisible, someone who has perfected the art of surviving in spaces where she's not wanted. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face as she watches the plaintiff's attorney shuffle through his papers with theatrical importance. No one knows that the woman they're trying to evict holds a Harvard law degree. No one even notices the way her eyes track every procedural error, every misstatement of law, every constitutional violation unfolding before her. She's just another black single mother facing eviction, another statistic in a system that seems designed to crush people who look like her. But when the landlord's attorney begins citing fabricated lease violations and presenting falsified documents, she leans forward slightly, her legal mind automatically cataloging each violation of due process. What they didn't know was that Michelle Williams hadn't just studied housing law at Harvard. She'd written her thesis on discriminatory eviction practices and had spent 2 years working pro bono with legal aid societies before life forced her to step away. The landlord, Robert Caldwell, a man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit that screams old money, sits behind the plaintiff's table like he owns not just properties, but people. His cold blue eyes scan the courtroom with the confidence of someone who's never lost, someone who believes the system exists to protect his interests. When his lawyer presents the third falsified document claiming Michelle had violated noise, ordinances that don't exist in her lease, Robert smirks. "Your Honor," the landlord's attorney drones, "my client has documented numerous violations by the defendant. Loud music at all hours, unauthorized pets, failure to maintain the property in acceptable condition." Each word drips with barely concealed racism, painting Michelle as the stereotype they want the judge to see. Michelle's 8-year-old daughter, Jasmine, sits beside her, swinging her legs nervously from the wooden bench. The child doesn't understand why they might lose their home, why Mama seems so quiet, why the man in the expensive suit keeps looking at them like they don't belong. Michelle reaches over and gently stills her daughter's legs, whispering, "It's going to be okay, baby." The judge, an older white man with kind eyes but clearly overwhelmed by his docket, barely looks up from his papers. This is routine for him. Another eviction case in a city full of them. He doesn't see the Harvard-trained legal mind sitting in his courtroom. He doesn't notice the way Michelle's jaw tightens when the landlord's attorney misstates tenant rights law. "Mrs. Williams," the judge finally addresses her, "do you have legal representation?" Michelle stands slowly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "No, Your Honor, I'm representing myself." The words carry weight she can't explain. "Not yet." Robert Caldwell leans back in his chair, practically radiating satisfaction. Another easy win against someone who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of housing law. His attorney had assured him this would be simple: a quick eviction of a tenant who was behind on rent by just 15 days due to a hospital bill that had drained her savings. But Michelle has been watching. She's been taking notes in handwriting so precise it could be mistaken for calligraphy. Every procedural violation, every constitutional misstep, every moment when due process has been trampled, she's documented it all with the skill of someone who spent years in courtrooms, just on the other side of the bench. The landlord's attorney presents his final piece of evidence, a lease modification that Michelle supposedly signed, agreeing to conditions that would make Snow White's stepmother blush. The signature is obviously forged, the dates don't match, and the terms violate 3 different federal housing laws. "Your Honor," Michelle says quietly, Standing again, "I'd like to cross-examine the plaintiff." The room goes silent. Even Jasmine stops swinging her legs. Robert Caldwell's smirk falters for just a moment before returning full force. What could this woman possibly know about cross-examination? And with just 4 words, "I'd like to cross-examine," she was about to turn this routine eviction into something that would make headlines across the state. Because sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one with the power to expose everything you've tried to hide. Before we continue with Michelle's incredible story, I need to ask you something important. If you believe that justice should be colorblind and that everyone deserves equal treatment under the law, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to sharing stories of real people fighting against injustice, and your subscription helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Also, I want you to rate this story so far on a scale of 1 to 10. Are you feeling that tension building? Can you sense that something big is about to happen? Drop your rating in the comments because I love hearing from you. And here's what I'm really curious about. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated you? Where people judged you by how you looked instead of what you knew? Share your story in the comments below because every voice matters here. Now, let's get back to Michelle and see what happens when she stands up. Michelle Williams had lived in the small 2-bedroom apartment on Peachtree Street for 3 years, paying her rent faithfully every month until the medical emergency that changed everything. She worked as a paralegal at a small firm downtown, a job that paid the bills but felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small after spending years in the rarefied air of constitutional law. Every morning, she walked past the partners' offices, where men her age, men who hadn't graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, men who hadn't clerked for a federal judge, made decisions about cases she could handle better in her sleep. They treated her with the polite condescension reserved for support staff, never imagining that the woman organizing their files had once argued before the Massachusetts Supreme Court. But Michelle watched. She always watched. She noticed everything. This way opposing counsel's arguments fell apart under scrutiny, the way her bosses missed obvious legal precedents, the way justice got twisted by incompetence, masquerading as expertise. Robert Caldwell owned 17 properties throughout Atlanta, all in predominantly black neighborhoods that were rapidly gentrifying. He had a system, a pattern that Michelle had started to notice even before she became his target. Find tenants who couldn't afford lawyers, create bogus lease violations, present falsified evidence, and count on the system to rubber stamp another eviction. The displaced families scattered to cheaper neighborhoods further from the city center, their children changing schools, their lives disrupted, their dreams deferred. On that Tuesday morning when everything changed, Michelle had arrived at her paralegal job to find an eviction notice taped to her apartment door from the previous evening. She read it carefully, her legal training immediately spotting the procedural errors. The notice claimed she owed 3 months' rent when she was only 15 days behind due to Jasmine's emergency appendectomy. It cited lease violations that didn't exist and gave her insufficient time to respond according to Georgia law. Michelle walked closer to the break room where her bosses were discussing a difficult housing case, her heart racing as she heard the familiar patterns of legal analysis she'd once lived and breathed. Those words weren't foreign to her. They were her native language, temporarily forgotten, but never truly lost. She whispered under her breath, "Violation of due process under the 14th Amendment. Failure to provide adequate notice under OCGA, paragraph 44, 7-50, and potential violation of the Fair Housing Act." Her supervisor, James Patterson, overheard and turned with a smirk. "Michelle, we're discussing complex legal matters. Could you please just focus on the filing?" But deep inside, something had stirred. The fire that had driven her through 3 years of law school, through the grueling bar exam, through those late nights researching cases that could change lives, it wasn't gone. It had just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. That evening, Michelle sat in her small kitchen with Jasmine doing homework at the table. The eviction notice spread before her like a battle plan. She pulled out her laptop and began researching Robert Caldwell, diving into public records with the skill of someone who'd spent years building cases from fragments of evidence. What she found made her stomach clench with anger, and her legal mind buzz with possibilities. Caldwell had been cited multiple times by the Atlanta Housing Authority for discrimination. There were patterns in his eviction filings, always against minority tenants, always with suspicious timing, always with evidence that seemed just a little too convenient. More disturbing, she discovered that Caldwell himself had a criminal history that had been expunged from public view but not from certain legal databases she still had access to through her paralegal work. 3 arrests for assault, 2 for fraud, and 1 domestic violence charge that had been dropped when the victim suddenly moved out of state. Michelle opened her laptop and pulled up the legal research databases she hadn't touched in 2 years. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory returning as she built a case file that would make her Harvard professors proud. Every citation was perfect, every precedent relevant, every argument devastating. By 2 a.m., she had constructed a legal strategy that would not only defeat the eviction, but potentially expose Caldwell's entire operation. She had found 17 other families he'd evicted using similar tactics, all minorities, all with suspicious documentation, all represented by the same attorney who seemed to specialize in fast-track evictions. As Jasmine slept in the next room, Michelle sat staring at her computer screen, her reflection ghost-like in the monitor. She thought about the path that had brought her here, how her mother's illness had forced her to leave her prestigious job at a Boston firm, how caring for her dying mother while raising Jasmine alone had drained her savings, how she'd taken the paralegal job just to survive. She had walked away from the law, but the law had never walked away from her. It was still there in the way she analyzed arguments, still there in the way she spotted injustice, still there in the fire that burned in her chest when she saw the powerful crushing the powerless. The last time she had felt this fire, she'd been standing in a federal courtroom arguing that a housing authority's discriminatory practices violated the constitutional rights of minority families. She'd won that case, saved dozens of families from losing their homes, made headlines in EB1 legal journals, but this time was different. This time it was personal. This time it was her daughter's home at stake, her family's future in the balance. Michelle looked at the eviction notice one more time, then back at her legal research. She didn't have to wonder if she could still practice law at the highest level. The 47 pages of legal analysis she'd just produced answered that question definitively. There was nothing else to say except what she whispered into the quiet kitchen. Robert Caldwell has no idea what he just walked into. 3 days later, the morning of the eviction hearing arrived with unseasonable Atlanta heat that made the courthouse steps shimmer like a mirage. Michelle walked up those steps with Jasmine beside her, both dressed in their Sunday best. Michelle in a navy blazer she'd bought at Goodwill and carefully tailored herself, Jasmine in a yellow dress that reminded Michelle of sunlight. Other tenants facing eviction that day looked defeated before they entered the building, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, carrying plastic bags filled with whatever documentation they could scrape together. Michelle carried a leather briefcase she'd forgotten she owned, filled with enough legal ammunition to level a city block. Robert Caldwell arrived 15 minutes later in his silver Mercedes, speaking loudly into his phone about cleaning out the trash from his properties. His attorney, Marcus Reed, met him on the courthouse steps, a man whose reputation was built on speed rather than ethics, who could process evictions like a factory line because he knew most tenants couldn't afford to fight back. Inside the courthouse, Michelle took her seat and watched as case after case proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Judge Harrison, overwhelmed and overworked, barely glanced at evidence before rubber-stamping eviction orders. The whole system seemed designed to move people through as quickly as possible. Justice sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. With 18, Michelle's case was called. She walked to the defendant's table with quiet confidence that made Robert Caldwell's attorney pause for just a moment. Something about her posture, the way she arranged her papers, the careful precision of her movements suggested this wouldn't be the routine case they'd expected. "Your Honor," Marcus Reed began, launching into his standard eviction speech, "my client has a clear case of non-payment of rent and multiple lease violations. We have extensive documentation showing that Mrs. Williams has been a problem tenant from day one." He presented his fabricated evidence with practiced theatricality. Forged lease modifications, falsified noise complaints from neighbors who didn't exist, maintenance requests for damage that had never occurred. Each document looked official, enough to fool a casual glance, but Michelle's trained eye caught every inconsistency, every telltale sign of forgery. "The defendant owes 3 months' rent, Your Honor, and has repeatedly violated the terms of her lease agreement." Reed's voice carried the weary tone of someone dealing with people he considered beneath him. Judge Harrison glanced at the paperwork with the same tired expression he'd worn for the previous dozen cases. "Mrs. Williams, what's your response to these allegations?" Michelle stood slowly, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, I'd like to begin by noting several procedural violations that have occurred in this case. First, the plaintiff failed to provide adequate notice as required under OCGA 4-7-50. Second, the eviction notice contains factual inaccuracies regarding the amount owed. Third, I believe some of the evidence presented today may be falsified." The word falsified hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Reed's confident smile flickered. Robert Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Williams," Judge Harrison said, suddenly paying attention. "Do you have evidence to support that claim?" "I do, Your Honor. But first, I'd like to establish that I owe only 15 days of rent, not 3 months, due to a medical emergency that has been resolved. I have documentation showing my payment history and the medical bills that caused the temporary hardship." Michelle approached the bench with documentation that was organized, professional, and thoroughly researched. Bank statements, hospital, bills, payment receipts, everything meticulously cataloged and cross-referenced. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose as he examined paperwork that looked more professional than what many attorneys presented. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I believe the lease modification that Mr. Reed has presented contains forged signatures and dates that don't align with the original lease agreement." Michelle's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the silk. She walked back to her table and pulled out a magnifying glass and a document analysis she'd prepared. "If the court will allow, I can demonstrate that the signature on this modification uses different pen pressure, different angle, and different letter formation than my verified signature on the original lease." Robert Caldwell was no longer smiling. He leaned over to whisper urgently in Reed's ear, but the attorney looked as confused as his client was angry. "Your Honor," Reed interrupted, "we're dealing with a simple eviction case here. The defendant is clearly trying to delay the inevitable with amateur legal theatrics." "Amateur?" Michelle's voice carried a note that made several people in the IB gallery look up. Your Honor, I'd also like to point out that the lease modification Mr. Reed presented violates the Fair Housing Act in 3 distinct ways, contains terms that are unconscionable under Georgia law, and includes provisions that no court in this state would enforce. She began citing case law from memory, her voice growing stronger with each precedent. In Drummond v. Atlanta Housing Partners, the court ruled that lease modifications presented without adequate consideration and containing discriminatory language are void ab initio. In Patterson v. Millennium Properties, falsification of lease documents constituted fraud upon the court, resulting in sanctions against the plaintiff's attorney. Judge Harrison was now sitting up straight, pen poised, taking notes on Michelle's arguments. This was not the routine eviction case he'd expected to rubber stamp. Mrs. Williams, the judge said carefully, you seem remarkably well versed in housing law. Do you have legal training? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Michelle looked at Robert Caldwell, who was staring at her with the first hint of worry she'd seen cross his face. She looked at Marcus Reed, who was shuffling through his papers like a man trying to find a lifeline. Then she looked at Jasmine, sitting in the gallery with wide eyes, not understanding the legal complexities, but somehow sensing that Mama was fighting for them in a way that mattered. Your Honor, Michelle said quietly, I have some legal background, yes. But more importantly, I have the right to defend my family against fraudulent eviction practices. Without thinking, she spoke the words that would change everything. And I move for sanctions against the plaintiff and his attorney for presenting falsified evidence to this court. Dead silence. 20 pairs of eyes turned to her as if she'd just declared war on the entire system. Robert Caldwell's face went red with anger and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Marcus Reed dropped his pen, the small sound echoing through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Michelle walked back to her table, but this time she moved like a lawyer returning to her war room, not like a defendant hoping for mercy. That wasn't just confidence radiating from her now. That was the dangerous calm of someone who had spent years in courtrooms and knew exactly how to demolish an opponent's case, piece by piece. The hunter had become the hunted, and Robert Caldwell was about to discover that the woman he'd tried to evict wasn't just another victim. She was his worst nightmare. In her small apartment that night, Michelle sat at her kitchen table with a worn leather portfolio that had traveled with her from Boston to Atlanta, through triumph and heartbreak, through the highest peaks of her legal career, and the quiet valley where she now found herself. On the cover, embossed in fading gold letters, Michelle A. Williams, Harvard Law School, magna cum laude, 2018. The pages inside were filled with commendations, newspaper clippings, and photographs that told the story of a legal prodigy who had once been featured on the cover of Black Enterprise magazine as one of 30 under 30 legal eagles to watch. There she was at 24, standing on the steps of the Massachusetts State House after winning a landmark housing discrimination case that had protected over 200 families from predatory landlords. Back then, constitutional law was her native language. She had memorized every housing rights precedent, every fair housing statute, every civil rights protection carved out by decades of legal warriors who had fought for justice in courtrooms across America. She had been the youngest attorney ever to argue before the Massachusetts Housing Court, the first black woman to win the Harvard Law Review's Morrison Prize for Civil Rights Research. The last time she had touched this portfolio, she'd been packing. Her corner office at Brennan Morrison and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious civil rights firms. The partners had begged her not to leave, offering her a partnership track that would have made her a millionaire before 30. But her mother's diagnosis had changed everything. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 months to live if she was lucky, and no one else to care for 8-year-old Jasmine. Michelle remembered that phone call like it was yesterday. She had been in the middle of preparing oral arguments for a case that could have established new precedent for housing discrimination lawsuits when her mother's shaky voice delivered the news that would rearrange her entire universe. "Baby, I need you to come home. The doctors say it's serious this time." She had walked into the senior partner's office that same afternoon and submitted her resignation, effective immediately. James Brennan, a man who had mentored her since her first day as a summer associate, had stared at her like she'd announced plans to join the circus. "Michelle, you're throwing away the most promising legal career I've seen in 30 years. Your mother would want you to succeed, not sacrifice everything for family?" she had interrupted, her voice sharp with pain. "Mr. Brennan, with respect, you don't understand. My mother gave up her dreams so I could have mine. Now it's my turn." The move to Atlanta had been supposed to be temporary. 6 months, maybe a year, while her mother fought the cancer and recovered. Michelle had taken the paralegal job just to pay bills and be close to the hospital. She told herself it was just a pause, not an ending. But cancer doesn't negotiate with career plans. The 6 months became 18 months of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, sleepless nights holding her mother's hand while Jasmine slept curled up in an uncomfortable chair. The temporary job became permanent when her mother's medical bills devoured her savings. The pause became a new reality that felt more like prison than choice. Her mother had died on a Tuesday morning in March, holding Michelle's hand and whispering, "Don't let my granddaughter forget that she comes from a family of fighters. Promise me, baby. Promise me you won't let anyone make you small." Michelle had kept that promise in small ways, helping neighbors understand their lease agreements, explaining tenant rights to friends facing eviction, writing letters to landlords on behalf of people who couldn't afford lawyers. But she'd never stepped back into a courtroom, never again felt the rush of legal combat, never again used the weapon she'd spent years sharpening to its finest edge. Until now. Until Robert Caldwell had made the catastrophic mistake of targeting the wrong family. She opened her laptop and pulled up the legal databases she'd avoided for 2 years. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she dove into Robert Caldwell's history with the focused intensity of a surgeon performing delicate work. What she found made her blood boil and her legal instincts sing with anticipation. Caldwell wasn't just a discriminatory landlord. He was the center of a web of corruption that stretched across Atlanta's housing market. Shell companies, bribed, inspectors, falsified documents, and a pattern of targeting minority families that was so blatant it practically screamed for federal intervention. But the most damaging discovery came at 3 a.m. when Michelle accessed criminal databases through her paralegal credentials. There, buried in expunged records that most people would never think to look for, was Robert Caldwell's real history. In 1995, he had been arrested for aggravated assault against a black family who had tried to buy a house in a white neighborhood he was developing. The charges had been dropped when the family mysteriously withdrew their police complaint and moved out of state. In 1998, fraud charges for altering mortgage documents also dropped when witnesses became uncooperative. In 2003, domestic violence against his ex-wife dropped when she suddenly received a large cash settlement and signed a non-disclosure agreement. Most revealing was the 2010 case that had been completely sealed. Federal charges for housing discrimination, mail fraud, and conspiracy. The case had been dropped not because he was innocent, but because he had turned state's evidence against bigger fish in a corruption scandal that rocked the Atlanta development community. Michelle leaned back in her chair, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Caldwell wasn't just a racist landlord. He was a criminal who had bought his way out of justice and rebuilt his empire on the assumption that his victims would never be able to fight back. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, until she found a number she hadn't called in 2 years. Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI White-Collar Crime Division. They had worked together on the Massachusetts housing corruption case that had made Michelle's reputation. Her finger hovered over the call button. Making this call would mean stepping fully back into the legal arena. It would mean late nights, intense pressure, and the possibility of making enemies of powerful people. It would mean choosing justice over safety, principle over peace. Michelle looked at the eviction notice still sitting on her table, then at the bedroom where Jasmine slept peacefully, trusting that Mama would find a way to keep them safe. She pressed call. "Sarah? It's Michelle Williams. I know it's been a while, but I think I've found something you need to see. How quickly can you get to Atlanta?" The courthouse was still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness when Michelle Williams slipped through the employee entrance using her paralegal access card. She had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, 3 nights that had transformed her from a defeated tenant into the legal warrior she had always been beneath the surface. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floors as she made her way to the law library, a sanctuary she had discovered during her months working in the building but had never fully utilized until now. The security guard, accustomed to seeing her during regular business hours, barely glanced up as she passed his station. In the silent library, surrounded by volumes of Georgia statutes and federal civil rights law, Michelle spread out her materials, like a general planning the final battle of a long war. Laptop open, legal pads covered in precise handwriting, copies of documents that would expose Robert Caldwell's criminal empire, stacked in carefully organized folders. No hesitation. She opened her laptop and began typing the motion that would change everything. Motion for emergency hearing and sanctions for fraud upon the court, with request for criminal referral to the United States Attorney's Office. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she crafted each argument with surgical precision. Every paragraph built upon the last, creating an unassailable legal fortress that would trap Caldwell in his own lies. She cited federal housing law, Georgia, criminal statutes, and civil rights precedents with the fluency of someone who had spent years mastering this linguistic weapon. The motion detailed not just the falsified documents presented in her case, but the pattern of discrimination Caldwell had perpetrated against dozens of minority families. She attached bank records showing payments to document forgers, communication records revealing his instructions to fabricate evidence, and, most devastatingly, the expunged criminal records that painted a picture of a man who had been gaming the system for decades. But Michelle's masterstroke was the connection she had discovered between Caldwell and a network of corrupt attorneys, judges, and city officials. Using her paralegal access to court databases and her Harvard-trained research skills, she had traced a web of bribes, falsified inspection reports, and coordinated attacks on minority communities that stretched back 15 years. When she finished typing, Michelle looked at the document that would serve as Robert Caldwell's legal death warrant. 47 pages of meticulously researched, perfectly cited, devastating legal analysis that would make her old professors weep with pride. She attached exhibits that told the story in cold, factual terms. Exhibit A, comparison analysis of forged signatures. Exhibit B, timeline of discriminatory eviction patterns. Exhibit C, financial records showing payments to document mills. Exhibit D, sealed criminal records obtained through proper legal channels. Exhibit E, FBI preliminary. Investigation report courtesy of Agent Martinez, who had worked through the night to provide federal resources. At 5:30 a.m., Michelle used the courthouse's electronic filing system to submit her motion directly to Judge Harrison's chambers, copying the district attorney's office, the FBI field office, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's investigative team. She marked it as an emergency motion requiring immediate judicial review. The courthouse began stirring to life around 7 a.m. as early employees arrived to start their day. Michelle remained in the library, making final preparations for the hearing. She knew what happened that morning. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. "Holy shit, Michelle. This is bigger than we thought. Federal task force is mobilizing. You just handed us the case of the decade." By 8 a.m., Michelle's emergency motion had created chaos throughout the courthouse. Judge Harrison's clerk called her cell phone with instructions to appear immediately for an emergency hearing. The district attorney's office was demanding copies of all evidence. 3 FBI agents were on their way to execute search warrants at Caldwell's properties. Michelle gathered her materials and walked to the same courtroom where, just 3 days earlier, she had been fighting for her family's home. This time, she carried herself like the constitutional lawyer she had always been, ready to deliver justice that had been delayed far too long. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Word had leaked about the emergency hearing, and journalists filled the gallery alongside housing rights activists, other tenants who had been victims of Caldwell's schemes, and lawyers who had heard rumors that something extraordinary was about to happen. Robert Caldwell sat at the plaintiff's table looking like a man who had just realized he was standing on quicksand. His attorney, Marcus Reed, frantically shuffled through papers with the desperate energy of someone trying to find an escape route from a burning building. When Judge Harrison entered, the courtroom fell silent with anticipation that felt electric. "I have reviewed Mrs. Williams's emergency motion," he began, his voice carrying a gravity that made everyone lean forward. "This court has never seen allegations of this magnitude presented with this level of legal sophistication." Michelle stood, her briefcase in hand, ready to deliver the legal performance of a lifetime. "Your Honor, what began as a simple eviction defense has revealed a criminal conspiracy that has violated the civil rights of dozens of families and corrupted the judicial process itself." She approached the bench with the confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms, who understood that this moment was what she had trained for her entire legal career. "I move for immediate sanctions against Mr. Caldwell and his attorney, dismissal of all pending evictions filed by the plaintiff, and referral of this matter to federal authorities for criminal prosecution." Judge Harrison looked down at the woman, who had walked into his courtroom 3 days earlier as an unrepresented tenant, and was now presenting federal-level legal analysis that would make senior prosecutors envious. "Mrs. Williams, these are serious allegations requiring serious evidence." Michelle smiled for the first time in months, not the polite, careful smile of someone trying to stay invisible, but the confident smile of a legal predator who had just cornered her prey. "Your Honor, I have all the evidence this court could possibly need, and the FBI is waiting outside with search warrants that will provide considerably more." Robert Caldwell's face went white as Agent Martinez and 2 other federal agents entered the courtroom, their presence announcing that this was no longer just a housing dispute. It was a federal case that would make headlines across the country. The UE pulled the courthouse security footage first, and there she was, Michelle Williams, moving through the building at 4:47 a.m. with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. But it was the database access logs that told the real story. 17 hours of legal research conducted with the precision and scope that only came from elite legal training. That's the woman who works as a paralegal in the Henderson firm, whispered District Attorney Karen Foster to Agent Martinez as they watched Michelle command the courtroom with arguments that were making seasoned prosecutors take notes. Judge, Harrison called for a 15-minute recess, during which the courthouse buzzed with whispered conversations and urgent phone calls. In his chambers, he placed a call to Harvard Law School's dean. The conversation was brief, but illuminating. When court reconvened, Michelle sat across from Robert Caldwell and his legal team, her weathered leather portfolio open on the table between them. The portfolio that had traveled from Cambridge to Boston to Atlanta, through triumph and tragedy, through the heights of legal success and the depths of personal sacrifice. "Mrs. Williams," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying new respect, "before we proceed, the court would like to understand your background. It's unusual to see pro se representation at this level of legal sophistication." Michelle looked across the table at Caldwell, who was studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that might destroy him. She could see the moment recognition dawned in his eyes, not of who she was, but of what she was capable of. "Your Honor," she said, standing with the same grace that had once commanded respect in federal courtrooms, "my name is Michelle Angela Williams. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School in 2018. I was a civil rights attorney specializing in housing discrimination law at Brennan, Morrison and Associates in Boston until 2022, when I relocated to Atlanta for family reasons." The courtroom went silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the soft clicking of phone cameras recording this moment. "I worked on the landmark Massachusetts housing discrimination case, Foster v. Beacon Hill Development, which protected over 200 minority families from predatory eviction practices. I've argued before federal courts, written amicus briefs for Supreme Court cases, and won the Harvard Law Review's Morrison Prize for Civil Rights Research." She paused, letting the weight of her credentials settle over the room like armor she was finally putting back on. "I didn't choose to leave law, Your Honor. Law chose me to leave it. My mother was dying of cancer, and my 8-year-old daughter needed stability. I took a paralegal position to be present for my family, to honor the woman who sacrificed everything so I could have the education and opportunities that brought me to this moment." Robert Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. He had spent his career targeting people he assumed were powerless, people without resources or knowledge to fight back. The realization that he had tried to evict a Harvard-trained civil rights attorney was sinking in like poison. "Mrs. Williams," he interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "if you're such a hotshot lawyer, why are you working as a paralegal and living in my—" He caught himself, but not quickly enough. "In your what, Mr. Caldwell?" Michelle's voice carried the calm precision of a surgeon making an incision. "In your slum? In your deliberately neglected property, designed to house people you consider beneath you? In the building you've allowed to deteriorate because you assume your tenants don't have the knowledge or resources to hold you accountable?" She opened her portfolio and pulled out a photograph. Herself at 25, standing next to Senator Elizabeth Warren at a housing rights rally, both of them holding signs demanding justice for families facing discriminatory evictions. "Mr. Caldwell, for the past 2 years, I've been watching you operate. Watching you target minority families with falsified documents, watching you present forged evidence to courts, watching you profit from a system designed to crush people who look like me and my daughter." Agent Martinez stepped forward with a stack of documents that made Caldwell's attorney visibly wince. "Your Honor, we've executed search warrants at 17 of Mr. Caldwell's properties and his business offices. What we've found corroborates every allegation in Mrs. Williams's motion. Michelle stood and walked to where Caldwell sat, her presence now commanding the room in a way that reminded everyone present that courtrooms were her natural habitat. "Mr. Caldwell, you want to know who I am? I'm the daughter of a woman who cleaned office buildings at night so I could attend law school during the day. I'm the granddaughter of a sharecropper who taught me that dignity isn't something you can take from someone. It's something they choose to carry." She placed a document on the table in front of him. His own criminal history, meticulously researched and legally obtained. But more than that, I'm the attorney who's going to make sure you never victimize another family again. The document was damning. 3 decades of complaints, sealed records, payoffs, and a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back to before Michelle had even been born. Financial records showing payments to document forgers, recorded phone calls where Caldwell instructed his employees to fabricate lease violations, bank transfers connecting him to a network of corrupt officials who helped him avoid consequences for his crimes. In 1995, you were arrested for assaulting the Jackson family when they tried to buy a home in Buckhead. Charges dropped when they mysteriously received death threats and moved out of state. Caldwell's face went red, then pale, then red again. In 1998, fraud charges for altering mortgage documents also dropped when witnesses became uncooperative. His attorney tried to stand, but Agent Martinez gestured for him to remain seated. In 2003, domestic violence against your ex-wife, Patricia. She withdrew charges after receiving a settlement and signing a non-disclosure agreement that's now void because you violated its terms by committing subsequent crimes. Michelle's voice remained steady, professional, devastating in its precision. And in 2010, the big one, federal charges for housing discrimination, mail fraud, and conspiracy. You turned state's evidence against other defendants to avoid prison time. What you didn't count on was that your cooperation agreement required you to refrain from further criminal activity. She pulled out another document, a copy of his sealed plea agreement with the federal government. Section 12 of your cooperation agreement states clearly that any subsequent criminal activity would void your immunity and subject you to prosecution for the original charges, plus any new crimes committed. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, too captivated by the legal dismantling happening before their eyes. "Mr. Caldwell, you've spent the last 13 years building a criminal empire based on the assumption that your victims would never have the knowledge, resources, or courage to expose you. You targeted single mothers, elderly tenants, immigrants, people you thought would disappear quietly when you stole their homes." Michelle walked back to her table, then turned to face him one final time. "What you didn't know is that I've spent the last 3 days building a federal case against you that's airtight. Conspiracy, civil rights violations, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Each charge carries a maximum of 20 years in federal prison." She sat down, opened her portfolio, and pulled out one final document. "And this morning, I received confirmation that the Department of Justice is forming a task force to investigate housing discrimination in Atlanta, with your operation as the primary target." Robert Caldwell stared at the woman who had destroyed his life, with the precision of a master craftsman dismantling a clock. The woman he had tried to evict, the woman he had dismissed as just another powerless tenant, had turned out to be his judge, jury, and executioner. In that quiet courtroom, they finally saw Michelle Williams not as a paralegal, not as a victim, not as someone to be pitied or dismissed, but as exactly what she had always been: a legal warrior who had temporarily laid down her sword but had never forgotten how to wield it. The next morning, Michelle stepped into the courthouse like always, but everything was different. The security guard, who had barely acknowledged her for months, stood to greet her with something approaching reverence. The court clerks, who had treated her like invisible support staff, now watched her with the respect reserved for legal legends. Tui, hallway buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. "That's her," people murmured. "That's the paralegal who brought down Robert Caldwell." But Michelle knew they had it wrong. She wasn't the paralegal who became a lawyer. She was a lawyer who had never stopped being one, even when circumstances forced her to hide that truth. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity with other victims of Caldwell's schemes, housing rights advocates, law students from Emory and Georgia State who had skipped classes to witness legal history being made, and reporters from across the Southeast who had driven through the night to cover the story. Judge Harrison entered with an expression that balanced judicial gravity with barely contained amazement. In 30 years on the bench, he had never seen a pro se defendant present a case that would reshape housing law enforcement across the state. "Mrs. Williams," he began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "this court owes you a debt of gratitude that extends far beyond your individual case. Your investigation has exposed a criminal conspiracy that victimized dozens of families and corrupted the very system designed to protect tenants' rights." Michelle stood, wearing the same navy blazer from Goodwill, but now it looked like armor, forged in the fires of justice, rather than the uniform of someone trying to remain invisible. "The eviction case against Mrs. Williams is dismissed with prejudice," Judge Harrison announced. "Furthermore, this court is ordering the immediate dismissal of all pending eviction cases filed by Robert Caldwell or his associated entities, pending federal investigation." The courtroom erupted in applause that started with the other tenants, families who had been living in terror of losing their homes, and spread through the room like wildfire. Michelle looked into the gallery and saw faces that reflected her own journey. Working mothers, elderly people on fixed incomes, immigrant families chasing the American dream, all of them victims of a system that had profited from their powerlessness. "Additionally," the judge continued, "this court is referring Mr. Caldwell's actions to the Georgia State Bar for investigation of his attorney, Marcus Reed, who appears to have knowingly participated in presenting fraudulent evidence." Reed looked like a man watching his career dissolve in real time. Caldwell sat in stunned silence, the reality finally sinking in that the woman he had tried to crush had instead become his destroyer. Agent Martinez approached the bench with a folder, thick, enough to stop a bullet. "Your Honor, federal search warrants executed this morning have yielded evidence of additional crimes involving bank fraud, tax evasion, and violations of the Fair Housing Act affecting over 200 families across metro Atlanta." But the EEO moment that would be replayed on news stations across the country came when District Attorney Karen Foster stood to address the court. "Your Honor, the state of Georgia would like to offer Mrs. Williams a position as special prosecutor for housing rights violations, with full authority to investigate and prosecute cases of discriminatory housing practices statewide." The offer hung in the air like lightning waiting to strike. Michelle felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom, the expectation that she would seize this opportunity to step fully back into the legal arena where she belonged. She looked at Jasmine, sitting in the front row with eyes wide with pride, at seeing Mama command a courtroom full of adults who hung on her every word. She thought about her mother's dying wish. "Don't let anyone make you small." "Your Honor," Michelle said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had rediscovered her purpose. "I'm honored by the offer, but I'd like to propose an alternative. The courtroom held its collective breath. I want to establish a legal HUD clinic here in Atlanta, specifically focused on housing rights for low-income families. A place where people like me, people who've been underestimated, dismissed, or forgotten, can access the same level of legal representation that wealthy defendants take for granted. She gestured toward the gallery filled with tenants who had been Caldwell's victims. These families don't need charity. They need lawyers who understand that housing isn't just about property. It's about dignity, stability, and the fundamental right to exist in spaces where you're valued rather than tolerated. Judge Harrison leaned forward, intrigued. What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Williams? Michelle opened her portfolio one final time and pulled out a document she had drafted at 3 a.m., fueled by coffee and the fire of righteous purpose. The Michelle Williams Housing Rights Clinic, staffed by recent law school graduates, retired attorneys, and legal professionals who want to use their skills to level the playing field. Will provide free representation for tenants facing discriminatory evictions, sue slumlords who profit from substandard housing, and train community members to recognize and fight housing discrimination. She paused, looking directly at Robert Caldwell, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. And we'll make sure that predators like Mr. Caldwell can never again assume that their victims are powerless. The applause was thunderous this time, led by the other tenants, but joined by lawyers, law students, and even some of the court personnel. Michelle felt tears she had been holding back for 2 years finally flow freely. Not tears of defeat or frustration, but tears of homecoming. Later that afternoon, she stood on the courthouse steps as reporters peppered her with questions about her background, her plans, and how it felt to go from facing eviction to becoming Atlanta's newest crusader for housing justice. "Mrs. Williams," called out a reporter from Channel 2, "what would you say to other people who feel powerless against the system?" Michelle looked directly into the camera, thinking of all the women like her mother who had cleaned office buildings. At night, all the families struggling to keep roofs over their heads. All the people who had been told they didn't matter. I'd tell them that power isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose to claim. I'd tell them that knowledge is the greatest equalizer, and that every person has the right to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity. She picked up Jasmine, who had been waiting patiently through the interviews, and I'd tell them that sometimes the person who looks most powerless is actually the most dangerous opponent you could face, because they have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The entire courthouse plaza erupted in applause that echoed off the buildings and seemed to shake the very foundations of injustice that had stood unchallenged for too long. 6 months later, Michelle Williams sat in her new office in downtown Atlanta, the nameplate on her door reading, "Executive Director, Williams Housing Rights Clinic." Sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked the same courthouse where she had once faced eviction, and instead delivered justice. The walls were lined with thank-you letters from families who had kept their homes, framed newspaper articles about the Federal Housing Task Force that had grown from her investigation, and photographs of the 23 law students and volunteer attorneys who now worked alongside her to protect tenants' rights across Georgia. Jasmine did her homework at a small desk in the corner, surrounded by law books and case files, growing up in an environment where justice wasn't just an abstract concept, but a daily practice. Sometimes she helped Michelle organize files, and when people asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she would say with absolute certainty, "A lawyer like my mama." On Michelle's desk sat a framed copy of the federal indictment against Robert Caldwell, 17 counts, including conspiracy, civil rights violations, and racketeering. He had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution to the families he had victimized. His property empire had been dissolved, with many of the buildings converted to affordable housing managed by non-profit organizations. The success of the Williams Housing Rights Clinic had inspired similar programs in Birmingham, Nashville, and Charlotte. Law schools across the South were requiring housing rights courses, and Michelle had been invited to speak at Harvard, where her former professors introduced her as the alumna who reminded us why we became lawyers in the first place. But the moment that meant the most came on a Tuesday morning when an elderly woman walked into the clinic, clutching an eviction notice and looking like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Ma'am," the woman said hesitantly, "I heard you could help me. My landlord says I got to be out by Friday, but I ain't done nothing wrong. I don't know what to do." Michelle stood up from her desk and walked over to the woman, seeing herself 2 years earlier in those worried eyes, recognizing the fear and helplessness that came from being dismissed by a system that seemed designed to crush people who couldn't fight back. "What's your name, ma'am?" Michelle asked gently. "Dorothy. Dorothy Washington." "Well, Mrs. Washington, you came to the right place. Have a seat, and let's figure this out together." As Michelle began reviewing the eviction notice with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to see injustice hiding in legal language, she remembered her mother's final words: "Don't let anyone make you small." Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay invisible.